only hear the one voice at the time. Please feel free to add your name and your organisation to your description on Zoom if you want to. If you don't, that's okay as well. If you would like to introduce yourself to other people on the call in the chat, please do. You don't have to, but please do if you'd like to. And as I said, the meeting is being recorded. There will be time at the end for questions and answers. So if you would like to pose a question, really any time as we go along, please put that in the chat. And then when it comes back to me at the end, I'll moderate the Q&A session and we'll go through the questions in order and hopefully try and answer as many of them as we can in this session. So I think that's the housekeeping. So I want to introduce to you our two speakers, Dr. Sanjeev Lingaya, who is Director of Reframing Race and the kind of mastermind behind Home Truths, which is a report that was issued in 2000, and now the programme Home Truths 2, of which the Race Equity series is part, and our guest speaker, Kimberly McIntosh. I'm so excited to hear from Kimberly today, so thank you so much for being here. Sanjeev will introduce Kimberly in more detail, but Kimberly is a writer, an author, a researcher, a policy specialist, and we're really pleased to have her here today. So please do ask questions. We're lucky to have her. Right, that's it from me. I'm going to pass over to Sanjeev to take you through the rest of the meeting. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Roberta, and good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Yes, so this is episode 3. I'm calling them episodes because that's more Netflix-like, isn't it? So, so that's what that's the language I'm using. So this is episode 3 of the Race Equity series, and the focus is inside intersectionality. And the reason for focusing on this is that intersectionality is a really live idea in civil society and beyond. But as with a lot of the Home Truths 2 work, what we're really trying to do is get practical and get towards solutions and actions. And although intersectionality is a live idea, it's our contention that it's not particularly well understood or particularly well mobilized in the interests of anti-racism and race equity. And so that's a bit of the work today. And there will also be, as with all the Race Equity series, there'll be further resources, in particular a companion note that my excellent colleague Christabel, who's on the call here as well, is working on, and that will give us a bit more detail and a bit more substance on the subject. So I will flag. So as Roberta says, we'll do some unpacking. One of the other aspects of Home Truths is the Further Faster program, and that's being facilitated by Parry Dillon and Martha Owajobi. And one of the things that we had a launch last week, and one of the things they reminded me about, and all of us about, is that kind of doing anti-racism is messy. So we will do some unpacking. I apologise in advance for those of you who are neat and tidy. We won't necessarily put it all back together with neat, easy answers. Because we're trying to build a different world here, and that isn't always neat and tidy. Before we do it, I'll do a very fast run through some of the kind of key ideas, which maybe you will have seen, hopefully, in the blog that accompanies this episode. Before doing that, it's as Roberta said, we're kind of very, very excited to have Kimberly McIntosh with us. So I'll do the official spiel and then I'll say a little bit else. So Kimberly McIntosh is a freelance consultant, researcher and writer with a focus on race and inequality. Kimberly is currently a consultant for Unbound Philanthropy and the policy lead for the Windrush Justice Programme at Action for Race Equality. You can check out her book, which is a brilliant book, Black Girl No Magic, Essays and Reflection on Living Whilst Black, published by the Borough Press. Please do buy it and support Kimberly's work. She's got it's such a beautiful and honest book about Kimberly's life and also what it might tell us about race, class, and gender. So I do encourage all of you to read it. It's such a brilliant read. Kimberly's such a brilliant person. Yeah, please support her brilliant and wise voice. Right, so that's that bit. So I'll go now. Christabel, would you put on, I think it's slide 3? Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So we'll do a little bit of just kind of laying some groundwork around intersectionality. So what it is and kind of how it is and isn't being used in the interests of anti-racism and race equity. So intersectionality, we define it as an analysis of systems of power and domination. So it helps to explain how legal and other life-shaping arrangements lift up some populations and hold down others. And very much in the latter category, we would include women and non-binary people, Black and minoritized ethnic people. Um, so second row in yellow, which kind of Pamela Daniels does all these kind of beautiful slides. So thank you, Pamela. In the kind of yellow egg yolk, that's to represent that intersectionality reminds us that organised racism, misogyny, class interests, ableism, homophobia, and so on are interconnected but not the same. So there are overlapping processes to these and practices and ideas involved across these range of kind of oppressive kind of actions and systems of ideas. And I think what this tells us is that we cannot slay these oppressive ideas and practices without slaying them all. So it's kind of because of their interconnection. So far that's reasonably straightforward. And then Christabel, could you do the next slide? It gets a bit more complicated. What we're arguing in the blog, and I think we'll follow through in the companion notes, is that intersectionality, because of its emphasis on how systems of power impact, for better or worse, particular populations, we can end up with an overemphasis on those who are negatively impacted. So what we call this kind of maybe sometimes looking at intersectionality through the wrong end of the telescope. And what this can mean is that we get into quarrels about which identity groups are the most disadvantaged in day-to-day life. So do not get me wrong, that does matter. But also, if we're interested in transformation, in wholesale transformation, that requires problems are dealt with at source, and that interconnected systems of domination are dismantled and replaced. So if we get into what we have found is that if we get into what one might call the kind of oppression league table kind of politics, it can result in whataboutery. So what about this group? What about that group? Which, especially around kind of racism, can mean that we end up doing very little. But here's an added complication: if we only think about oppressive systems, then the danger is that racism gets set aside. So we talk about the kind of politics of oppression, and for those of us who've been working for a long time on kind of anti-racism and race equity, there is a kind of slippage that can happen where kind of race gets pushed to the side. Right, Christabel, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So what we're suggesting in the blog, and we'll kind of build out in the companion notes, is that we can think about kind of two tracks in civil society. So we've organized these in columns, or Pamela has. So column 1, there we think about overarching structures, and we could call this the high and wide approach. So that means for civil society organizations, that is the work of appraising internal practices and mindsets such as recruitment, retention, pay, and strategy development. And also, again, for civil society organization, again, focusing on external work, including recalibrating interventions in the world to advance race equity and broader liberation and equitable outcomes. So so the work there on that kind of first column on the left hand side is really about what is the work that civil society can do to replace with life affirming alternative systems and structures that currently hold down or fail to lift up Black and minoritized ethnic people, as well as other traditionally marginalized groups. So that is the what we call the kind of high and wide strategy. So the second column, that gets a bit more kind of practical. So that's staying focused. So we call that kind of down and narrow. So there, I suppose that's a call for intersectionality not to be so overarching as to do nothing about racism. So that thinking of every population facing oppression can mean that we don't do anything, for example, on the position of Black women in civil society. And a note here, if you look at the original work from Kimberlé Crenshaw, which is about kind of more than 30 years old now, her original work was a critique from the perspective of Black feminism, with a focus on labour markets and violence against women. So, in some ways, what we're kind of calling for is going back to the roots of the concept. And avoiding what we might call kind of the inflation associated with intersectionality, where it becomes about everything, and it's hard to do work on everything all at once. So, going back to the metaphor of the kind of telescope. So this is kind of where it gets complicated, and this is the work that we need to kind of step into, the messy work. So what we need is some kind of combination of telescope, periscope, and microscope. So there's kind of the ability to kind of move through kind of different levels to kind of work on anti-racism and for race equity. I will say that one of the things that makes this work really, really important, but also kind of challenging, is that in kind of Christabel's background research, as we're kind of looking to develop the companion notes, there aren't too many examples of using these different kind of levels in civil society, but we will say more in the companion notes. And just kind of finally, just to re-emphasize that finding a way through some of these challenges, but also a laser-like focus on racism, that is part of the messy day-to-day work of anti-racism and race equity, and kind of invite mainstream civil society to join in with that. That kind of the mess that is kind of making a different kind of reality. So that's the talk. So Christabel, from to the thank you. So we will, thanks very much, Christabel. We'll move into kind of the conversation part with Kimberlé now. So, Kimberlé, maybe just at this beginning bit, whether you just might say a little bit about kind of your work and kind of how intersectionality kind of figures in it. I know you have worked inside mainstream civil society, inside the kind of race equity sector, but also kind of as an independent kind of writer and researcher and commentator and so on. So would you like just to say a little bit about kind of where you were situated in relation to intersectionality? You're on mute.
I've done the classic thing. It does. How many years have you been using Zoom? And yet every time still. But what can you do? So to me, intersectionality is definitely a framework that I use to, a framework in which all of my different strands of work kind of works within. So I definitely agree with the definition of intersectionality that Sanjeev put on the screen. And I remember at a round table a few years ago, an expert came in to talk to us about intersectionality from the perspective of a lawyer. She was a black female American lawyer, and she kind of explained it as analogous to mixing copper and tin, in that when you do that, it creates bronze, and that is in itself kind of it has its own distinct properties, but the elements, it's different individual elements, but then it forms something completely new. And I kind of still see intersectionality in that way. And I think what I wanted to do with most of my writing, whether that is with my book or kind of doing freelance articles, is how you can mix personal stories to kind of speak to systemic problems. So there are lots of different forms of kind of discrimination, but also advantage and disadvantage that have shaped the way my life looks. And I'm interested in what that tells us about British society at large. And so I move through the world in a particular way. And that's what Crenshaw said that her concept was meant to kind of be about, is that it's kind of how do our individual identities intersect in a way that influences how we're viewed and how we're understood, how we're seen, and also the opportunities available to us and our outcomes, whether that's in the labour market or the way you get treated when you're walking down the street by the police. And so for me, I find it really interesting to kind of try and use the personal and mix that with research to kind of show how my different identities have impacted my life at different times, whilst also seeing the limits of seeing things through a personal lens, because my identity can only tell us so much about British society. And so I think it's then important to talk about what structures in our society have led to outcomes in my life, and how is that different for other people, because ultimately I have some class advantage now, and what does that mean in my life and how does it shape it, and which government policies have shaped my life and shaped my outcomes. And so I think from like a writing perspective, intersectionality is always at the core of most of the things that I do. But then with my other hats on, so at the moment I'm working on Windrush justice, and so kind of thinking about the way that intersectionality shapes something like the Windrush scandal and who it impacts. Obviously, it has a huge racial component, so it's mostly the Black Caribbean community, but not exclusively, that are affected by the Windrush scandal. But it's also very much affected by age, so it's mostly an older cohort of people who are affected. And I'm sure that gender does play a role, but when I'm thinking about Sanjeev's blog, that isn't necessarily a lens that I use when I'm doing that work, because I think we do have to be specific. And so that is really a kind of the intersection of race, class, and age affecting a particular cohort of people. And then we have to think about, which policies have led to that outcome, and then what do we need to do to change those. I think one of the things that maybe we'll get into it, because intersectionality has kind of lost some of its meaning from overuse, and because it's moved outside of the sphere that it was created within and the context it was meant to be used within, is that it was meant to speak kind of directly to certain types of discrimination and disadvantage. And I think sometimes now it can be used as a kind of catch-all for everything kind of under the kind of EDI banner, which isn't necessarily what it was made for. So I think being specific, like you said in your blog, about those specific intersections and what they mean for the kind of work we're trying to do is really important.
Thanks, Kim. I just wonder if we can maybe say a little bit more about your work for the Windrush Justice Programme at Action for Race Equality. I mean, partly maybe kind of for participants here, just to say a little bit about what the programme is doing, and then maybe if we could just kind of delve into a little bit of like the people being the wrong kind of people, and how kind of policy therefore, because those intersections of identity, they are the wrong ones, and how that puts people in the firing line.
Yeah, sure. So I'll do a little bit about kind of the Windrush Justice Programme and the work, and then move into why that particular group has been impacted in their kind of how their particular identities or why they've ended up in that position. So the Windrush Justice Programme is a 2-year program, sorry, a 3-year program, and it kind of came out of a piece of work done by a Windrush lawyer called Jackie McKenzie, who has been like very prominent in the space, supporting people affected by the scandal and taking on a lot of cases pro bono, kind of in 2017, 18, and before, to try and support people to regularize their status. And she did a bit of analysis and found that even though the schemes have been set up, so we've got a compensation scheme and we have a scheme to support people to regularize their status, that there wasn't much support for this. These small groups had popped up around the country to support people with their claims, because it's particularly an elderly cohort, and they're quite long forms, and a lot of the support that was funded by government is online, so you had issues of digital exclusion as well. There are a lot of small groups supporting people, but they had no funding and no budget, and so the program is there to give small grants to those groups so that they can support people to apply to those schemes. And then also I'm working on policy as part of that program. So what is it that we need the government to change so that the scandal can come to an end? And there's a lot that they need to change. And some of that is around kind of completely revamping the compensation scheme so that it's fair and it's fast and easy to access. But then there's also issues around the hostile environment, for example. So when they put in the Windrush scheme, people are still fearful to come forward because they fear, what if I get deported? And it's because we haven't had the main cause of the Windrush scandal is a series of immigration acts, which were heavily racialized from the 1970s, but also the implementation of the hostile environment in 2014 and 2016. And that was targeted at visible migrants. And it was meant to encourage people to not to block people from being able to access public services, to make their lives impossible to live. And I think what can be quite interesting about Windrush is that the cohort that have been affected by it, in theory, were not meant to be the group targeted because they are long-standing residents and they've been here for a very long time. But a policy like the hostile environment specifically targets people of colour, regardless of whether they're seen as a good migrant group or not. And so regardless of the intentionality of the policy, the outcome has been that this has been the prime group that's been targeted. The government was warned that that was a risk, but they didn't do anything about that. But I guess it also shows that there are limitations to the good migrant frame, because that didn't protect the people who were impacted. But it has meant that there's been more of a response from government than you would normally get for something that's framed as an immigration issue and is targeted specifically, that is specifically impacting Black people disproportionately. So it's quite an interesting case. But so what was your follow-on question?
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm particularly kind of interested in kind of how that combination, I guess, of age, kind of migration status, kind of race in inverted commas, that how you think that might have come into play. I think in the last bit of your, in a way, it may not be that kind of Caribbean elders were, you know, the people that they wanted to get, but clearly, you know, it certain groups are targeted, and this is, you know, it's done by design, if not intention, if you kind of understand the distinction. So just kind of wondering how you've seen that kind of come into play in the Windrush scandal.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right that it's within the design of the hostile environment policy. So even though that's not necessarily the group that the hostile environment policy was designed to target the most, that is the outcome regardless. And the reason that it kind of intersects with race immigration and age is that I mean, one thing is that I think the government didn't anticipate that there would be such a strong public response to people who had those identities. They didn't realize that being kind of a Black elder would garner public sympathy, which I think actually speaks quite a lot to how those identities are viewed and valued in British society. But the disproportionality came from the age of when people moved, meant that you were more likely to be impacted by the Windrush scandal. And so then you ended that. So it tends to be people who are older because it's the date that they arrived in the UK. So it's kind of so you've got an intersection of age with, and then with it being mostly a Black Caribbean population, just the time that people were moving it was mostly people were moving from the Caribbean at that time. So now you've ended up with a policy disproportionately impacting Black elderly people. And yeah, the solution to that really would be to deal with that at the source, which would be to end the hostile environment policy, and then and then having bigger conversations about our immigration policy more widely, which would then not just benefit people affected by the Windrush scandal, but also lots of other groups of migrants and lots of other ethnic minority groups who, for example, would be affected by the right to rent. So a landlord is much more likely to rent to someone if they have a British passport, or I'm sure most of us, well, all of us will have done a right to work check in order to start our employment. And that's much easier if you have a British passport. And so if we make these changes at the source, it won't just benefit this group of elderly Black Caribbean people. It would also benefit anyone who doesn't have a British passport, or anyone who's got to use a biometric card instead of having a British passport. And so there are benefits to kind of like what you say in your blog, Sanjeev, to going and dealing with things at a more structural level, still keeping that, like honing in on the racial justice kind of thrust of it, but the benefits are much, much wider and generally benefit other marginalized people as well. And so it's important that for something like Windrush, it's very easy to just want to support that particular cohort, particularly because it's more politically palatable. But we won't get the change we need for those people if we don't go to the source. And then we definitely won't get the changes that we need in wider society for other marginalized groups as well.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, because then that approach, that dual approach of high and wide and kind of narrow and focus. And of course, everyone affected absolutely deserves the compensation, but the right legacy is to have a deep correction. And you know, and that's part of the work, isn't it? That's really helpful. So Kim, I wanted to think about kind of how we design something else, if you're using the language of design, and maybe the role of mainstream civil society in that work, because obviously I think you at various times have worked inside, been employed by mainstream civil society, and then other times kind of worked alongside mainstream civil society. I wonder if you have any reflections, and it is hard because there aren't a long list of examples of this is how to do it exactly right. But I wonder if you have any reflections for kind of participants in this call who are working within mainstream civil society about their role in kind of making intersectionality more than a buzzword, more than a thing that we say we kind of all nod along to, but actually something that lives and breathes in a kind of institutional work, in institutions work. Do you have any reflections on making this thing come alive?
Yeah, I think from my experience, I think I've seen when it's worked well. It obviously depends on the remit of the kind of, what your organization does, the kind of work it does. I think I've seen organizations find it easier to kind of mainstream intersectionality within their work if they're already working primarily supporting people who have another protected characteristic, because I think it's an easier entry point then into thinking more broadly, for example, about the intersection of race and class, or race and gender, or gender and disability, um, because they've already kind of got that foundation there. I think I've seen it more of a struggle when that isn't the case, and then it's quite difficult to know where to start. I think it's also a bit easier if like organizations that do are more kind of in the think tank space or do analysis, because then they often start with trying to thread that through the kind of analysis they do, or threading things through programs that people deliver, and starting from there. I've definitely seen that trade unions, I think, are doing like a much better job with on things like that. I wouldn't want to speak to whether Black workers in the trade union movement feel that things have improved enough, because that would be a much bigger conversation. Um, but I think trying to think about how you can mainstream racial justice through your work and through all of your work seems to be like quite a good place for people to start. Um, but I think there's also a challenge in kind of knowing who should do what and who should do the work, basically, and who's best placed to do certain types of work. Um, People not wanting to take up space, and if you want to. So I found that partnerships work quite well. So um, like what comes to mind is kind of Runnymede and the Women's Budget Group. So the Women's Budget Group they used to do just a gender analysis on kind of how public spending affects women, and then over time, with the partnership with Runnymede, started to move that towards looking at how those same decisions affect Black and Asian women across different levels of income. And then both organizations will speak with a racial justice lens, but then sometimes it's more appropriate for the organization that's, kind of prime reason for existing is to work on racial justice, and kind of deciding kind of the best way to distribute that work at the best time, and who has the best expertise for that. But I think it gets trickier and more messy when organizations, that's not the kind of work they do. And then I think you can start with looking internally at kind of your internal practices, how you hire, kind of working environment, pay and progression, recruitment, and kind of start looking at your internal culture, and then thinking about mainstreaming through the kind of work that you do can be a good place to start. But I think in terms of the future visioning work, I don't want to speak for people, but I think that can be quite a scary place for people to go, and people don't necessarily know how to navigate that space. And maybe also that the funding isn't always there to give people the space to think about what would we want our society to look like structurally, kind of maybe outside of the parameters of the world that we exist in right now, and then trying to think about the steps that we need to take in order to get there. And I think that's a much bigger challenge and much scarier, and something that I also don't have the answers to, but I think is really important, because I definitely feel at the moment that there isn't, I'll only speak for myself here, necessarily a strong vision for kind of where we want the country to go. And I think there's a lot of space there for civil society to think about that instead, and then try and think about what we need to do to try and get closer towards that kind of world.
That's really helpful, and it's kind of a couple of things just to kind of pull out. That there is something about mainstream institutions doing this work will probably end up not looking very much like they are today, and including doing really deep, meaningful kind of partnership work, which I think is also kind of challenging. So that's one thing. And then just to kind of speak about the kind of adjacent program, the Further Faster program, the Leaders program that's going it's just started as part of Home Truths 2, and one of the things that Martha and Puri will be doing with participants there is an exercise absolutely kind of core to, you know, kind of whether we use a language of visioning or dreaming, but it's like kind of coming at this from a really kind of different place. And that's, you know, I feel like in all of us, for lots of reasons, we're conditioned not that dreaming is bad. It's a muscle to be exercised, and most of us are, you know, kind of have flabby dreaming muscles, I suspect. Thank you, Kim. That's really super helpful. So I want to I think Roberta has put in the chat that we welcome additional kind of questions from participants via chat. Roberta, shall I hand over to you? I've got plenty of other things I'd like to ask him about. So if we're having to kind of filter, it won't be wasted. But I'll pass back to you for now, Roberta.
Thanks, Sanjeev. And I know that there's lots and lots to unpack. And I think for me, as I've been kind of listening and you know, reading Sanjeev's blog that kind of set up this session and reading around it, it's the issue of trying to eat the whole elephant at the same time, you know, trying to solve everything, trying to do everything. I think that's ever present for many of our ACEVO members and for those of us who want to move things forward, who want to take practical action. And so that what you talked about initially around the sense of kind of paralysis and I mean, I don't like the phrase "what about her." I think it's used in a very negative way. So what about this? What about that's used to kind of delay and deflect. But I recognise it and I see it. I see it quite a bit. Even for those of us who want to move and take strides forward. So what particularly struck me was your points around looking at this and, you know,